Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 7 of Featherweight Flyers, the review series for the relatively few, but at the same time reasonably strong selection of ultra lightweight track day sports cars. Cars which are road legal, but are in effect affordable race cars in real life. Something to capture generally the spirit of the Formula 1 Grand Prix in something that can be actually used on the street. It's a relatively simple concept, but one which is very popular. There are numerous manufacturers, and there have been as well over the years, producing cars for this niche, and it's still as popular as ever, with companies like Caterham, Westfield, Ariel, Elfin, and various others still producing cars in this category. On the game though, we tend to have more of the mainstream ones, like the Lotus Elise, the Vauxhall VX220, cars like that. There are some, though, which are a little bit more obscure, like the Hummel Berlinette, the Garaya, the Tomicara ZZS, etc. And this particular model is one of the better known models, probably one of the models which, when you think of featherweight sports cars, you'd probably think of relatively quickly. And that's the Vauxhall VX220. Now, the version that I'm featuring here is the Turbo, which is the faster of the two. Now, there are two from Vauxhall, two from Opel, but they're all essentially the same car with differing powers. And I am reviewing, in particular, the Vauxhall version. It doesn't really matter whether you buy the Opel or the Vauxhall, it just depends which brand you'd rather support. So, what do you get? Well, you get a car which was aided in its development by Lotus, and a car which I personally actually prefer over the Lotus Elise. I've never been a huge fan of the Lotus Elise, I know a lot of people are, but on games it certainly looks nice, but it's not a car that I'd ever want to own. I don't particularly ever want to drive one, I don't really care about the car, and on the game it's always got kind of tricky handling. It's good, but it's also temperamental. The VX220, ironically enough, considering how similar it is and that Lotus had a hand in it, I would say actually handles better than the Lotus Elise. Now, that's just my opinion, of course, and there are probably, as with various other rivalries, such as the Evo versus Impreza rivalry, people on both sides of the argument. I am on the side of the argument supporting the VX220. I think it's a better all-round car. So what do you get? Well, for just under 50 grand, which straight off the bat is a good price in this category, considering that many of the other cars in the series are around double that price, if not more. So that's a good start. You get a 2-litre turbo engine, it's mid-mounted, rear-wheel drive, and it puts out 400 horsepower fully tuned. Now that doesn't sound like a huge amount, but that's more than the light car company Rocket, that's more than most of the Lotus Elises and Exesias, including the Motorsport Elise, that's more than the Hummel Berlinette, and various others. That's more than the Garaya, that's more than the Tomicara ZZS. So it's a seriously powerful car, the Vauxhall, even though 400 horsepower doesn't initially sound like that much. It also puts out 300 foot-pounds of torque, which is decent enough for the class, again, a lot more than many others, and it weighs in at 839 kilos. So it's not quite as light as some of the others, certainly not as light as, say, the Lotus Elise Sport 190 or the light car company Rocket, but it's still not heavy by any means. Now, the PP is 542, which I would say is pretty good. It's very easy for the PP in these vehicles in particular, ultra lightweight cars, to be too high. The PP can very, very easily go too high. 542 is perfect, I would say, for this car. As far as horsepower per tonne, it puts out 477, which is pretty decent, and the performance is good. The top speed isn't necessarily quite as strong as the Elise, not by much, but not necessarily quite as strong. The acceleration though is very good, and as I mentioned earlier, I would actually say that this is a superior handling car to any of the Lotus Elises on the game, up to and including the Motorsport version. And the reason why I say that is because the Elise, to some degree, always has a very tricky front end. Now you can tune the diff, the suspension, etc., and fix a lot of that issue. Add downforce, sticky tyres, etc., they all help. But it's always there. that temperamental front end is always an issue on GT6, and that's just not there with the Vauxhall. The Vauxhall handles in a much more traditional way, and with the right setup, even with no camber, no toe, and more weight than the Lotus, it can outperform it around corners. The handling is, I would say, one of the best in the game, actually, not just in the sports car class, but it's one of the best handling cars on GT6, period, as far as I'm concerned. It's a brilliant handling car. Very easy to drive, extremely beginner friendly, very dependable. The handling doesn't really shock you. Handling on other vehicles such as the Ghariah, the Tomicaira, the Lotus, they can sometimes surprise you, maybe get a little bit twitchy on certain tracks. That just doesn't happen with the Vauxhall. Now, the payoff to that is that the handling is generally a little bit stiffer on the Vauxhall, and that is partially due to the extra weight. It's not that much worse though. It doesn't feel heavy, it doesn't feel sluggish, it's excellent. In fact, I would say the handling, to put it into perspective for somebody who perhaps hasn't driven a fully tuned VX220 on the game, is actually kind of similar to a toned down touring car. That's the kind of way that the VX220 handles. Dependable, and it feels sometimes almost like an all-wheel drive car rather than a rear-wheel drive, which I consider to be a good thing. Overall, the Vauxhall is a car which is perhaps sometimes overlooked by some people because of the fact that it's not necessarily as exciting to look at, and people assume that it's probably not as good. Well, that's what people seem to think anyway, because not many people I see use the VX220. Most people tend to go for cars like the KTM Crossbow, the Elise, etc. Whereas this car is, I would say, brilliant in its own right, especially for less than 50,000 credits. So I'd recommend checking it out, and that's it for this episode. So I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.